A memorial service has been held in Minneapolis for George Floyd, the African-American man killed by a white police officer last month. Mourners stood in silence for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, the amount of time it took Floyd to die as the police officer held his knee on his neck. Floyd's death has sparked protests across the U.S., with demonstrators calling for an end to discrimination and police brutality. Civil rights activist Reverend Al Sharpton said it was important to keep fighting for justice.
George Floyd's story has been the story of black folks, because ever since 401 years ago, the reason we could never be who we wanted and dreamed to be in is you kept your knee on our neck. What happened to Floyd happens every day in this country, in education, in health services, and in every area of American life. It's time for us to stand up in George's name and say, get your knee off our neck.
Well, DW correspondent Stefan Simons is in Minneapolis and joins us now. Stefan, a powerful message there from Reverend Sharpton. Did his eulogy offer any sense of hope that George Floyd's death could prove a turning point in America's effort to address police violence and racism?
Yeah, I think it actually captured what the overwhelming feeling is here. When I say feeling, then just because I don't have any other and better word for it, but what it is, it almost feels like there's a paradigm change here, and people feel there is a paradigm change here, and that's what they're telling us. They are done, of course, with how things were. They're not looking back anymore at this in the same way they did maybe just 8 days, 10 days ago when Mr. Floyd was killed at this very place here. For them, it's now forward, and it's in a different way forward, and it's with a vision, and that vision is to change America, not just Minneapolis, not just the police department here, and not just the state, Minnesota, but the entire country and the justice system in this country, and many, many other things where structural racism is a daily occurrence to them.
10 days after George Floyd's death, what's the situation on the streets of Minneapolis?
In Minneapolis, it's like in any or in most other states now, the violence is pretty much gone. Here in Minneapolis, entirely gone as far as we know. It's peaceful protesting. It's forwarding the cause. It's people think they are and understand themselves as being part of a movement now. In other states in the United States, you have the pictures. We all see the pictures. There is the occasional run-in because of a curfew break with police, but compared to what it was like about a week ago here, this is peaceful protesting. This is furthering a cause. This is being part of a movement, people say, and not letting up. When they say no justice, no peace, they really mean it.
Yes, sir.
President Trump's response to George Floyd's death and the ongoing protest, Stefan, has drawn fierce criticism. Could it affect his chances of re-election in November?
I'm sure that this is a possibility. The president's poll numbers are in the basement and heading actually below floor ground at the moment. At least that's what the latest polls suggest. However, there has to be something said about a president who failed to actually grasp what is going on in America right now and does not exert any leadership for those people here, because that's what they're saying. The president is missing in action, basically. He's not taking any leadership. He's not showing any empathy. He does not really understand what is going on and what is necessary for America to happen. This is hurting, in their minds, him definitely in his re-election bid and his re-election chances. Now, having said that, I don't think the president had many friends here before anyhow, but he definitely didn't make any here with being the law and order, or self-proclaimed law and order president.
Stefan, thank you very much. That was DW Stefan Simons there in Minneapolis. Protesters have taken to the streets of many cities across the United States. As Stefan mentioned, DW's Alexander Van Namen has been following one man who's attended rallies in Washington, D.C. every day to demand justice and an end to police violence.
You better be there. You better be there.
He's angry, but he hasn't lost hope. Taking to the streets every day, Kamal Hodge is one of the activists at the heart of the protest in Washington.
Don't shoot! Don't shoot!
Riding his bike across the city, Kamal doesn't recognize his hometown, now dominated by a heavy police and military presence. For him, it doesn't feel safe. He's had many guns pointed at him, he says, from people wearing a badge.
They would come up and be like, "Let me see your hands." And I would show them my hands. And then they would ask trick questions like, "Let me see your ID," which requires me to reach in my pocket. Then he might pull a gun and be like, "Let me see your hands." And you'd be like, "You just asked for my ID, I'm getting my ID." But then they continue to be hostile and aggressive. And then eventually they'll ask, "Can they pat me down?" and stuff like that.
That's what it means to be black in America, he tells me, 52 years after the killing of Martin Luther King Jr. Back then, this seems to be a watershed moment for the U.S., but what makes this moment so dangerous is the man in the White House, Kamal says.
And Donald Trump is literally, he wants a war. Because if he can start a civil war, then guess what? He can stay in office for a little while longer. So he wants this war. He wants it to kick off like this. He wants a martial law. He really wants everyone to act completely out of control so he can have a purpose for his actions.
In the city center, they are marching again. Kamal is an electrical contractor, but since the pandemic started, there's been no work for him, he tells me. Together with his friends, he's devoted all his time to peaceful protests. They don't support the looting and burning, but understand that many young people are bored and angry and use violence to get the authorities' attention.
You gotta let people do what they do. You do your peaceful thing, you do your non-peaceful things, because either way, you both still out here trying to make an attraction and something going on.
A few blocks from the White House, more and more federal forces arrive. Many people here are angry, seeing the National Guard being deployed against them. The exchange gets heated.
You a soldier! Yeah, straight up. You ain't a soldier!
I felt a lot of anger inside because, you know, you look at these people as people. Like, you want to be considered a human yourself, but then you treat other humans as if we're animals or some sort. I just got really upset.
As night falls, some protesters leave, fearing the police could use tear gas or rubber bullets against them again. But Kamal and his friends stay regardless of what might happen.
I think the patience is the best portion for us to stay afloat, to continue this for a long-term thing, because, you know, it's going to take a long time for this to actually be corrected.
He says he's never felt so energized and exhausted at the same time. Justice for George Floyd, that's what he wants, and a real change in America.
Don't shoot! Don't shoot!
Well, here in Germany, Chancellor Angela Merkel has been reacting to the death of George Floyd and its aftermath. She criticized President Trump's leadership style, but she also acknowledged that Germany, too, has problems with racism.
The murder of George Floyd is horrific. Racism is horrific. And U.S. society is very polarized. I think that politicians should aim to unite and to reconcile. I think that President Trump's style of politics is very controversial, that's clear. Racism has always existed, but unfortunately it exists here in Germany too. We should put our own house in order and hope that enough people in the US will move forward with peaceful protests.
Well, what George Floyd's final legacy will be, we cannot say, but we can say tonight that the impact of his death has the potential to fundamentally change American society, and with it, many societies around the world. An inflection point, as some have said, or it could become one of many points in a long continuing staccato of racism and police brutality in America. My first guest tonight says that the impact will be a lasting one of change. In her latest book, Prejudential: Black Americans and the Presidents, Margaret Kimberly examines the role of all 45 U.S. presidents in America's relationship with race. Margaret Kimberly is a peace and justice activist and editor and senior columnist for Black Agenda Report, a news and opinion website and radio program. Ms. Kimberly joins me tonight from New York City. This is her first time with us on the day. Ms. Kimberly, it's good to have you here with us tonight. If you were delivering the eulogy for George Floyd today, what would be the first sentence?
I would say that since he was killed, 10 more Black people have died at the hands of police in this country. It was horrific to see this man being murdered, and that spurred protest about his death, obviously, but about many injustices in this country, police violence being just one among them. And the revulsion was so strong that for the past week, for more than a week now, there have been constant protests all over the country, not just restricted to Minnesota. So this man who nobody knew, an ordinary working person, has become a touch point for millions of people around the world. And we have to honor his memory by getting justice for him, but also getting justice for the many nameless people who are killed, but not on camera. So we don't know their names, but we know that they exist.
You talk about justice. All four of the police officers involved, they now face charges. Derek Chauvin, he faces second-degree murder charges, which means intent to kill. The Attorney General of Minnesota, however, has warned that it is hard to convict the police. What do you say to that?
Well, it's hard to convict the police because prosecutors usually don't want to convict them. They get a 99% conviction rate for everybody else. If they had the same commitment to putting police away as they do for anyone else, then he can be, the four of them can all be convicted, and cops have been convicted. But there has to be a commitment to do it. There has to be a seriousness. There has to be a commitment to, first of all, making them know that they can be punished, that they can't get away with it. This happened because this cop assumed, and he wasn't wrong actually, he assumed that nothing would happen to him, because that's the case 99% of the time. Mm-hmm. So Mr. Ellison, who is a former congressman, by the way, needs to step up his game. He needs to, I think he's trying to lower expectations because he's afraid of what a jury will do. But he needs to do his job as the Attorney General in the state of Minnesota and make sure they're convicted. They do it all the time for everyone else.
The U.S. President Donald Trump, we understand, was not invited to today's memorial service. What role, in your opinion, what role does he play in the events that we have seen in the past week?
Well, it's interesting. Police murder didn't start with Trump. We should not act as though Trump is some sort of outlier. He only became president 3 years ago, January 2017. And we had a problem with police killing, I'm going to correct myself, 3 people every day. One of those people will be Black. 1,000 people killed by police every year. And this happened before Trump. So I'm not going to say he had any role in the crime taking place, but as president, he should give assurances to the people that he will use the power of his office to prosecute these cops. Barack Obama never used the powers of the Justice Department to prosecute these police. If local law enforcement fail, the federal government can prosecute. And that's what we should expect all presidents to do. Now, Trump, of course, has not been helpful in his remarks in responding to these protests. He had this ridiculous stunt in front of a church, and his attorney general was tear gassing people to get them out of the way so he could pose for a picture with the Bible. That sort of thing just incites more violence, and it gives people the feeling that their concerns are unheard. So his response has been very, very unhelpful, but Obama, when Baltimore erupted after a man named Freddie Gray was killed by police, he called the protesters thugs. So I think it's important not to think of Trump as being so different.
Yeah, I want you to take a listen to what former President Barack Obama said just last night. Take a listen.
Just remember, this country was founded on protest. It is called the American Revolution. And every step of progress in this country, every expansion of freedom, every expression of our deepest ideals has been won through efforts that made the status quo uncomfortable. And we should all be thankful for folks who are willing in a peaceful, disciplined way to be out there making a difference.
There, the former president says it's even a part of American history to protest.
Yes, but that's just Obama's platitudes. It's, which seems to be the only thing he can say these days. I guess because he's not president anymore, he can't get the best speechwriters. But, and I'm being sarcastic, obviously. Nobody needs him to tell us that we have the right to peacefully assemble. Nobody needs him to tell us that it is the people who have always made positive change in this country. We know that. But for 8 years, he had the power, he had the authority to get these killer cops. There was a man here in New York City named Eric Garner, and like George Floyd, his last words were, "I can't breathe." And the Obama Justice Department did nothing to that cop. And all he got was finally fired from his job. It took 4 or 5 years for even that to happen. So we don't need to hear from Barack Obama. He really needs to just sit this out.
What about a possible future president? You posted this photo on your Twitter feed today, or maybe it was yesterday. I want to show that to our viewers. It shows the presumptive Democratic candidate, presidential candidate Joe Biden, taking a knee inside a church. And you wrote that this is what you see when you stay up past your bedtime and you say God is punishing you. So tell me, how is he punishing you?
Oh, it was such a stupid picture. I was just making a joke. I was like, if I'd been in bed, I never would have seen it. I mean, Biden gave this horrible speech in the black church. I believe it was in Philadelphia. And it was supposed to be a response to George Floyd's killing and the protest. But Biden, in his typical manner, made a mess of it. And he said something weird about how police, if they're going to shoot people, George Floyd wasn't even shot, but that police should learn to shoot people in the leg and not, instead of in the heart. I mean, the man is he has some sort of cognitive problem. Yeah. That's a whole other story. But he posed for this picture with this black congregation, and he's on one knee, like Colin Kaepernick, the football player, made famous. And it was just stupid for Joe Biden, of all people. One of the people, by the way, when he was a senator, who helped write the crime bill in the 90s, and he bragged about writing the bill, which put so many black people in prison. And imprisonment begins with interactions with police. It begins with police brutality, and it can end in death. And it's pretty shameful for this man to hope that we forget all of that and pose for a stupid photo op when people are rising up in righteous indignation.
Yeah, people are rising up. And when the protests began last week, when some of these protests descended into violence and looting, there were calls for the protests to remain peaceful. I want you to take a listen to what the mayor of Atlanta said.
If you want change in America, go and register to vote. Show up at the polls on June 9th. Do it in November. That is the change we need in this country. You are disgracing our city. You are disgracing the life of George Floyd and every other person who has been killed in this country.
Ms. Kimberly, I know you've been critical of the mayor But I want to ask you,
Yes.
why shouldn't she call for protests to remain peaceful and for people to vote for change at the ballot box? Because if you look at what happened in 2016, a lot of people are complaining now about the way things are. But if they had to tell the truth, they would have to say that they didn't bother to vote.
Well, I'm not going to tell people not to vote, but voting in this country, you usually just end up with mediocre politicians like the mayor of Atlanta. It wouldn't have been a problem if she had just asked for peaceful protest, but she went on this rant about people disgracing the city, and she lumped all protesters together. And this always happens. There can be legitimate protests. There's always going to be a small group of people who are turned to petty thievery or something. But she lumped them all together, and she implied that every protester was a criminal. And so if she wanted to talk about peaceful protest, that's all she needed to do. But to give people the impression, first of all, it's just a lie. Mm-hmm. These elected officials, including Black elected officials, don't do anything to protect their people. There is nothing about the act of voting that will end police violence. That's just a lie. Mm-hmm. So we need people like her who are just tokens, who are just figureheads, who give the impression that Black people actually have some representation. We need them to, frankly, just shut up right now. There was nothing in her comments that was at all helpful to anyone.
Well, is there a political party or a politician in the U.S. who you would say is reaching out to people? You know, I think about where I grew up in North Carolina, rural North Carolina. You know, there aren't many middle-class North Carolinians there anymore. The poor whites, the poor Blacks, the poor Latinos, they all have more in common than they don't have in common now. But I don't see any political party that's trying to reach all of them and bring them together. Do you?
Unfortunately not. There's neither the Republicans or the Democrats do that. We have smaller parties like the Green Party. I'm a member of the Greens. And we are growing and trying to reach out to people. But there was an effort in the Democratic Party, in one of the major parties this year. Senator Bernie Sanders, his campaign sought to bring people together. He raised issues that have been unaddressed, which I think have also contributed to these protests. And the Democratic Party establishment got rid of him. They rigged the system against him, and they foisted Joe Biden on us. That's what we get from voting. That's what we get from the establishment. And that is why people have learned, they've learned the hard way, that electoral politics is not the only means. It's actually the worst means of getting effective change. One of the things I hope that in the aftermath of these protests and the police trial, I hope that people remember that and turn to themselves and start to remain in solidarity, develop solidarity with one another, and seek out non-electoral means of change, because the system has made clear it does not want real involvement from people. It does not want any talk of change at all.
Well, if it doesn't want any change, then do you believe that American society can ever become colorblind and become what the founding fathers proclaimed, that all men are created equal?
Well, the founding fathers were a bunch of hypocrites. They didn't believe anybody was equal. They were mostly slaveholders, so I don't think we should look to them.
But what they said at the time, though, Ms. Kimberly, what they said at the time, though, was revolutionary for the way people thought then. I mean, what about bringing that into the 21st century and having everyone equal? Do you think we can reach that?
We can. It was revolutionary for them, but America can't change without really, I'm going to say really revolutionary change for everyone. There has to be fundamental change in this country. First of all, there has to be a recognition that these crimes have taken place over the centuries. And then we can, once there's honesty, and once there are real mechanisms in place to get rid of inequality, to get rid of the police state, to get rid of mass incarceration once and for all, to do justice by the people in many different ways, to bring real democracy. They let us vote, but we rarely get what we want, even if the person we vote for happens to win. So yes, we can have a non-racist society, but it's a lot of hard work, and we can't do it with platitudes and phoniness from politicians.
Margaret Kimberly, editor and senior columnist for Black Agenda Report. Ms. Kimberly, it was a pleasure talking with you. We appreciate your time tonight and your insights. Come back again.
I certainly hope to. Thank you very much.
Well, Donald Trump's threat to send in the U.S. military to deal with civil unrest in the U.S. has been met with a stiff rebuke. Trump's former defense secretary, Jim Mattis, has accused the president of trying to divide America. And even his current Pentagon chief, Mark Esper, has said that he does not agree with Trump's threat to send in troops.
Police in riot gear continue to watch over crowds gathered near the White House. They've become a constant presence here in Washington since George Floyd, an African American, was killed in police custody last week. On Monday, police forcefully drove back protesters in order to enable President Trump to visit a nearby church. Before he stood outside St. John's, Bible in hand, he had threatened to deploy the military to quell the unrest.
If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them.
Thousands of National Guard troops have already been called up. But Trump is facing a backlash from all sides. In a blistering attack on the president, Trump's former defense secretary, Jim Mattis, has accused him of dividing America. He's also criticized Trump for even considering using active duty troops for law enforcement. Meanwhile, Trump's current defense secretary, Mark Esper, has opposed the use of military force.
The option to use active duty forces in a law enforcement role should only be used as a matter of last resort and only in the most urgent and dire of situations. We are not in one of those situations now.
Even General Milley, the highest-ranking figure in the U.S. Armed Forces, has issued a statement reminding the military that they swear an oath to support and defend the Constitution and the values embedded within it, and that it also gives Americans the right to freedom of speech and peaceful assembly. As this apparent rift between the president and his top brass emerges, protests continue across the U.S.